Well, thank you, Ninian, for chairing and for the fantastic talks that we've had so far. Really interesting to consider, the state level and, this black and white content and real right and wrong expressions online. And then also with Camille to be thinking about engagement and hate speech and what's getting people emotionally involved at that group level. So I'm Tom Cartmill. I practice as a clinical psychologist, and I research the role of emotion in radicalisation and de-radicalisation of the far right. I work with the School of Social and Political Sciences, and I'm part of the Evolution Lab within the School of Psychology at the University of Melbourne, where I'm writing a PhD. As a clinical psychologist, I speak intimately with people from a range of different backgrounds and specialise in disorders of extreme thought, feeling and behaviour. So people confide in me their darkest thoughts, those that are hidden from everyone because they are too embarrassed, too afraid or too ashamed to admit. Together, we explore the origins of these thoughts and feelings, and we try and make sense of them and then enact change. Training in psychology is heavily quantitative. A lot of regressions, trying to predict things. But clinical psychology, on the other hand, brings this world of facts and numbers to bear on an individual's psychology or reality. Today, I share 16 interviews with current and former far-right extremists and their sympathisers. The findings have implications for researchers, clinicians, social media industry professionals and policymakers. So I wanted to understand the emotional life journey of people who turn to far-right extremism and those that have returned. So I thought I would ask them. The only way to come close to knowing the internal dialogue of feeling and emotion is to establish rapport and ask them. That's what I do as my day job as a clinical psychologist. I recruited through Twitter, Gab and Reddit and spoke over Zoom. The research was conducted on the traditional lands of the Camaragal and Wurundjeri people. I use phenomenology to access their lived emotional perspective, their context informed by emotion. For example, when I speak to anger, I'm extracting their thoughts, memories and feeling, the physiological sensation, muscles clenched, and the target of that anger, be it towards themselves or outward. In phenomenology, the researcher acknowledges their own biases and emotion to most accurately represent the participant's experience. These 16 were hard to reach. They're particularly suspicious of researchers. So I made contact with 207, exchanged messages with 46, 18 agreed to an in-depth conversation with a clinical psychologist, and 2 interviews were removed from the present analysis as their ideology was incel without enough overlap to the far right. Participants were not paid and were initially highly sceptical. I made my research intentions clear to all, including that I may disagree with their beliefs. My genuine transparency may have encouraged reciprocity. These 16 were prepared to speak with me. They didn't hang up mid-interview, and they appeared to be reciprocal and genuine in sharing their history. On Twitter and Reddit, most were polite and expressed care, even if rejecting my request. On Gab, I was met with palpable paranoia and anger, even among those who ultimately accepted an interview. Other Gab users would chime in and encouraged participants to boycott my research. I found that gently challenging this scepticism with respectful irreverence and humour helped to encourage a degree of trust. On Gab, I was conscious of my own frustration with being misrepresented on gender, sexuality and race, and my apprehension at their stated intention to dox me or otherwise use the interview for their gain. This apprehension was not unfounded, as it turned out. Clearly, we don't have time to cover each participant in depth. However, I will explore two. One, a current, and a former, as their experiences convey the degree to which such a journey makes complete sense when understood at the qualitative level. They all make complete sense at this level. And in that sense, I believe there lies enormous opportunity. Grant, in his late 30s, his peak engagement with extremism was actually with the far left, enacting eco-terrorism with Earth First. Experiencing severe neglect in his childhood, he appears to have generated a longing for connection, accompanied with a hypersensitivity or fear of rejection. His engagement with Earth First meant a passion for the environment and a love of the fight against logging companies. This was then challenged when a schizophrenia diagnosis contributed to his perception that he was being manipulated by his comrades on the far left. In angry response to this perception, he severed ties and moved to the opposite extreme. Now, holding far-right beliefs, Grant spends considerable time online espousing Nazism with emotions of scepticism, paranoia, and resentment combined with curiosity. This meant that Grant was open to being interviewed, but then he chose to record the interview without my knowledge and published a copy of the interview online, which felt like a betrayal of trust, given the apparent rapport and humour evident in our discussion. A positive was that other National Socialists on Gab reported listening to the interview, which was impressive because it was 2 hours long, and verified Grant's life experience as similar to their own, in turn validating the research. Although it was frustrating to have been recorded in this manner and troubling to hear his vitriolic commentary that accompanied it, I felt sorry for Grant. I could see opportunity for a slow return to the mainstream if somehow his previous passion for positive change could be leveraged and his trust established and maintained. Sam, in her early 20s, formerly Atomwaffen Division. Her intention was to replicate the Christchurch Mosque massacre. Her manifesto was written and the group were in the final stages of preparation. Sam had a traumatic childhood. Her parents were neglectful and were so distracted by their own problems that they failed to provide guidance or set appropriate boundaries. Sam felt powerless and worthless. She was treated this way. In high school, she was involved in street fighting and would get hurt, and she saw this as a personal failing. Sam found the prevalent ideal of empowered feminism to be incompatible with her own self-loathing and life experience. She did not feel empowered. This led to anger at the perceived betrayal of the political system and was a stark contrast to the ideology of neo-fascism that provided Sam with purpose and drive. In her words, at least they were being honest with me. Sam had no aha moment of epiphany. However, there were profound events of personal growth. The horror of the planned terrorist attack became too much for her, whose fear was amplified by the threat of losing newly emergent compassionate connections. These connections were made when her far-right only social media network, Iron March, was shut down and she joined more diverse internet platforms. These new friends gently challenged her views with apparent unconditional love and kindness. I empathise with Sam. Her life experience did not reflect the empowered sense of feminism that was communicated in the Hillary Clinton campaign, for example, or indeed the reality conveyed in the overturn of Roe v. Wade. It may not match with our own experience or what we think the world should look like, but it was Sam's reality, generated from trauma, neglect, and resultant self-loathing, and we can't begrudge her that. Sam's online posts at her extreme would have conveyed the what? Anger, resentment, contempt, and sadness. However, if restricted to the quantitative, we would have lost the why. At a group level, emotional experience appears to propel radicalisation against a commonly shared background of childhood neglect, trauma, and resultant emotional volatility, often led by family violence or parents who struggled with relationships. Heightened emotional behaviour, for example, parents running away or neglecting to provide guidance or boundaries. Generally, this contributed to an unstable sense of self, an over-identification with perceived ideals of masculinity, often as an attempt to reassure oneself or guarantee one's safety. Considerable suspicion of political institutions and capitalism was juxtaposed against the trust and empathy for those who shared their beliefs. In one case, love blinded a participant to their partner's racist views until it was too late. Unfortunately, fear of rejection or being cancelled often contributed to participants remaining in these movements for far longer than they would have otherwise. In contrast, emotional experience also motivated de-radicalisation. Curiosity and openness meant that once the seed was sown that a belief might be wrong, many began to question everything. Insight and awareness of the realistic consequence of planned terrorist activity generated fear that supported positive change. Such insights also contributed to the experience of shame and guilt. Shame being one's perception of the public's view of their beliefs and behaviour, and guilt being one's judgment of one's own identity, which in turn served as a motivator to assisting others leave the movement. Receipt of empathy and compassion circumvented cancel culture fear and fast-tracked recovery. A participant highlighted the difference between forgiveness and empathy, where forgiveness is an unfair labour to demand. However, empathy provides someone with the opportunity to change. Across those identifying as trans, perceived masculine ideals were especially polarising and motivated considerable action to address the discontent and discomfort of not measuring up to those standards. These ideals were emphasised by family and exaggerated by initial denial of their gender. Participants reflected on their emotional experience of social media and commonly reported that pride and joy encouraged further engagement with the far right online, while fear at potential consequences contributed to disengagement. Interestingly, pride often came from a sense of accomplishment, having learned the nuances of far-right online language, while joy was derived from shared memes and humour. Such experiences were not mirrored offline. Online, these people were distinguished, held status, and felt respected. Offline, their lives were a shambles. So what does this mean for us as researchers, clinicians, industry professionals, or policymakers? Extremism research clearly benefits from the insights available through phenomenological qualitative inquiry. Phenomenology adds a narrative and realism that is at times lost in the statistics of big data. People are willing to participate if you can connect with them through honesty and irreverence. Appreciate the participant's possible psychological state. Loneliness will require a degree of empathy, whereas anger, a degree of acknowledgement. That would be tough. Your own safety is important. Anticipate a threat and protect yourself. Zoom calls with no camera on with currents may reduce exposure risk, along with a virtual private network and a pseudonym for social media. Clinicians could consider the therapeutic approaches that might best suit someone like Grant or Sam. Enduring emotional volatility, instability of self, and black and white thinking lends itself to motivational interviewing and dialectical behaviour therapy. Motivational interviewing poses questions that gently probe the rigidity of polarised thought and bring curiosity, openness and encouragement to thought and action in line with reducing harm. As part of motivational interviewing, the clinician acknowledges the experiences that would reinforce the extreme beliefs. This is particularly relevant if we consider the fear regarding cancel culture. Dialectical behaviour therapy, designed for treating complex trauma similar to that reported by most participants, provides practical skills for managing intense emotions, understanding and developing the self, and contemplating alternative points of view. For industry professionals, there is a tricky balance between evoking emotion to sustain attention and generate user engagement, while not providing an environment that is supportive of extremism. Gently turning the algorithms to promote diversity of thought and feeling may reduce outrage and allow opportunity for people like Sam to discover other interests and begin to improve their self-esteem. For social media companies, this might establish a new triple bottom line where the company is respected and valued for its care of those engaged. Childhood trauma and neglect and emotional volatility does not lead indiscriminately to far-right extremism. However, it was a clear predisposing and precipitating factor for my participants. Policymakers should consider strategies to increase mental health support and education throughout school to make up for possible shortfalls in parenting. Emotion regulation should be part of school curricula. Such a shift would improve executive function, the ability to hold complex ideas and consider them from multiple points of view, while bolstering self-esteem and confidence. Maths, science, logic are prioritised at school, however they mean little if children are too dysregulated to engage. Valuing emotion education would also give many in the community the ability to empathise and accept others' failings without necessarily providing forgiveness. In conclusion, to understand emotion in extremism, we need to appreciate people's hidden thoughts and feelings, that which cannot easily be quantified. Each of the 16 current and former extremist journeys make complete sense at the level of the individual. The complex interplay of emotional intensity, anger, sadness, disgust, joy and love, empathy and compassion leave many avenues for enabling and reducing extremism. We need more qualitative research in extremism. We need to consider therapeutic approaches for extremists that address emotional volatility and improve executive function. And we must provide diversity of thought and develop policy that supports development of emotional regulation. Thank you.